Of the nation of Israel. For the last few weeks, we were reading from Genesis, and we had to do a constant reminder that Judaism had not yet been formed, that a lot of the elements that we identify from Judaism were not really quite there yet. By the time of the writing of this book, some elements are there. There is a structure, there is a nation, they have temple priests, they have a prophet, they've got administrators, and they have a king, and that is Samuel. The story's not about Samuel, though. It's a story about David, and you might recognize the very familiar story of David and Goliath. David, the young shepherd boy who stood up to a giant warrior dressed in armor, and his armor just gleamed like the sun. And how David went ahead and felled him. That's the story for today, but it actually, let me set it up for you just a little bit more. They're in two separate camps on opposite hills, and the valley in between is kind of like the lines. And on one side you have the Philistines, and on the other side you have the Israelites. It kind of reminds me of Berlin, where on one side you had the Germans, and on the other side you had NATO forces or U.S. forces. Or maybe think more commonly today, North Korea and South Korea. They're at that line that separates the two countries. You've got soldiers from either side. And there's always a lot of posturing. There's always a lot of saying, look how mighty I am. And if you dare cross this line, I'll squash you. We're very much aware of that line. It's been in the news for who knows how long. But we need to know that it's not the first line that's been drawn. It's a line that humanity has faced repeatedly, and specifically at the story of David and Goliath. They're there, the two forces, the Philistines and the Israelites, are posturing against each other. It is important to note that the Israelites were afraid. They were very much afraid. And they did not want to go and fight the Philistines. Let us now listen to this passage from the book of Samuel, as read by Sue Lapp, Robert Shedden, and myself.
During the time of King Saul, the Philistines had gathered their forces for war against the Israelites. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with a valley between them. A champion named Goliath came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs were bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel,
"This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. If he's able to kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us."
On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were terrified. For 40 days Goliath came forth every morning and took his stand, defying the army of Saul and sending every Israelite into retreat. Now David was the youngest son of a sheepherder named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and his 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. Jesse instructed David to take roasted grain and loaves of bread for his brothers who were fighting against the Philistines, and to learn news of their condition. Early in the morning, David left for the battlefield as Jesse directed. He reached the camp as the Israelites and the Philistines were drawing up their battle lines. David ran to the field and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking to them, Goliath stepped out and shouted his defiance. David could not believe that no man confronted Goliath, so he asked his brothers,
What will be done for the man who removes this disgrace from Israel?
They replied, "The king will give great wealth to anyone who kills him. He will also give his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes." David, offended by the defying words of Goliath, decided to accept the challenge, and he approached Saul.
Do not lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him.
Saul replied, "You're not able to go against this Philistine. You are only a young man, and he is a warrior from his youth." But David said,
Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. I have fought and killed lions and bears to protect the herd. The Lord who rescued me from the teeth of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine.
Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Then Saul put a coat of armor on David and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword and tried walking. Realizing that he could not fight with such heavy armor, he removed them. He took his staff, chose 5 smooth stones, put them in his pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with a sling in his hand approached Goliath. Goliath laughed at the sight of David and mocked him.
In your arrogance, you laugh and mock me. You come against me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I approach you in the name of Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head.
As Goliath stepped closer to attack, David moved quickly toward the battle line, reaching into his bag for a stone. He slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead, and the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. David ran and stood over Goliath. He took hold of his sword and cut off his head. When the Philistine army saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines. Their dead were strewn along the road to Gath and Ekron. David took the sword and the head of Goliath and brought it to Jerusalem.
Would you please pray with me? May the words from my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Grace and peace be with you on this day. So are you familiar with the children's tales of the tortoise and the hare? Or how about the little engine that could? Are you familiar with the movies of Rocky, Star Wars, Karate Kid, Forrest Gump? What do all these things have in common? Well, these are stories about the underdog. These are stories about a person or an individual who was going to face insurmountable odds, and everybody said, "You're not going to make it, you're going to fail," but the person persevered and triumphed. These are stories that we love. Everybody loves to go see movies of this sort. They're uplifting. They remind us that we too have the possibility to overcome the challenges that are faced before us. So today's scripture passage is one that most people are familiar with. And even if you've never read it, just the cultural references to David against Goliath are out there. There have been many, many children who have seen the cartoons that kind of lead to something of that sort. But the story is much broader than just a young shepherd boy fighting a large armored man. The story is actually one of communal victory. The story is one about having a relationship with God. So we could hear it and take it at the individual level, or we could take it in the broader level as well. It's a story that is full of statements of who would have thought? Who would have thought that a young shepherd boy tending to his sheep could fight off lions and bears? Who would have thought that a young shepherd boy would go and meet a warrior at the battlefield? Who would have thought that just one slingshot with a smooth stone could give him success? And so forth and so forth. Who would have thought is actually possibly something that David's brothers and his family members were all just full of amazement and wonder. If we were to read the entire passage the way that it's put together in the Bible, you see that David's brothers, who David has to go and give him bread and grain so they could sustain their strength, they kind of like send him back. Just go back to the fields. Go back and do your chores. Go back and tend to the flock. But then David is inspired to step up and meet the challenge set forth by Goliath. Now, the thing is that David was the weakest person there on the field. Every soldier had years of experience of fighting and training. Every soldier was a full-grown man and possibly weighed a good 50 pounds more than he did. And he was just at 12 years old, 13 years old. We're not really quite sure. He was not a small 6-year-old, but he still was not a full-grown man. The point is that he was for sure not at the appropriate place for him, because he was the weakest person. And the challenges, the way that they were done, is that you had to go head to head, soldier against soldier. And so the way that it was set up, David, a child, fighting Goliath, having to put on armor and so forth, he was doomed to fail. The grown men in that battlefield knew it too, and that's why they didn't take the challenge. So from his weakness came the strategy of how to defeat Goliath. From his weakness as a child came the right approach. Because if you approach Goliath man to man, mano a mano, you were doomed to fail. But if you found a way around it and used some cunning, then you just might win. And that's exactly what happened. It's a universal story, because at one point or another we could all identify with the different characters of the story. At one point or another in our lifetime, we have faced insurmountable odds. We have faced something that has been much larger than ourselves and didn't really quite know how to do it. At one point or another, we have been inspired by the small individual who faced those challenges and gave us the inspiration to move forward. At one point or another, we have played every single role there in that story, because the story is actually much larger. You see, David did not defeat the Philistine army. David defeated one opponent. The Philistine army was defeated by the Israelites. And as the story was read, once they saw that David won, every man, every soldier there took up arms and ran to the battlefield, inspired by David's courage. And the Philistines took off running, but it was too late. And the story says that the number of dead Philistines filled the street between two towns. And so, in this storyline, we could be part of the Israelite army as well. We may not have been the David. We may not have been the person who stood and faced the giant. But maybe we were the ones who were inspired and then rushed forward and joined the cause. Or possibly, maybe we were as Jesse. Maybe we raised a child that could be the David. Let's talk about Jesse. Jesse being the father of David. Kind of makes you take a look at that parenting, the way that they did it. I don't know that my family would ever allow me to put my children in a field where there might be bears and lions. Definitely is not, a few sheep is not worth it. But there he was. And according to the story, he had to defend the herd against all sorts of attacks. That kind of training, that kind of combat training, that kind of situations that David was put in builds character. But more importantly, it gave him the faith and the conviction that he needed to know that he could face Goliath. For ultimately, conviction and faith are the foundation that's needed for courage. Yes, David had a lot of courage to face Goliath and to go to battle. But he also had those elements that are needed before courage. Those elements that would make him know deep in his heart that he could do this. It is a another thing to learn there, that how Jesse was sending bread to the troops and sending grain. And then if you read the biblical passage, it also says that he sent nutrients and all sorts of other food to the leaders as well, so that they could all eat. So possibly we may not be the David, and we may not be the members of the army or of the team, but we know how to support. We know how to send our $5 a month, or we know how to be part of the fundraiser. Part of this church community is a family that is seeking justice for their son, who died in a violent manner, was basically murdered. And the murderer is still roaming around, walking around free. And they're trying to get justice for their son. And so the way they're doing it, they have to hire an expensive lawyer, because they already went through the public defender's office, and it didn't yield the results that they wanted. So they have all sorts of fundraisers going on to help them get the money needed to hire the good attorney that would then represent them in court. Many of us are part of a variety of different such actions. I know that every month $3 out of my checking account go towards the polar bears, because I fell victim to one of those commercials where you see this tiny little polar bear floating in the middle of nowhere, and he looks so cute, and there's the mama bear with the baby bear, and I'm going, oh my God, And so here I am. And after 3 years, I don't know how, $3 a month, I don't feel it, but I know that I'm part of a larger movement, and my $3 are matched with somebody else's $3. And I sure hope that that polar bear has been given a better home. By now, my $3 have amounted to more than that. The Goliaths in the world. The Goliaths in the world are those who think of themselves very large and powerful. And then just because of their might, because of their shiny suit, they can go ahead and they could have their will be done, are being challenged all the time. And they're being challenged by the Davids of the world. And they're being challenged by those who support the Davids of the world. And sometimes the Davids of the world win. And sometimes they don't. And another generation has to come forward and take on the mantle. A modern day David is one that I'm reading about in a book called In the Company of the Poor. In the Company of the Poor is a series of interviews and conversations with two very instrumental people. One of them is a priest, Gustavo Gutierrez, who's the leader of liberation theology. And then the other one is Dr. Paul Farmer. Dr. Paul Farmer is a Central Floridian, studied over in Gainesville, at the School of Medicine. And once he became a doctor, he went over to Haiti to take care of the people living in abject poverty there. And during the 1980s, Haiti was an astounding number, something like 62%, 65%, who knows, were suffering of HIV/AIDS. And Dr. Paul Farmer took it upon himself to face off with the pharmaceutical companies so that the medication for HIV/AIDS can be given for free to the Haitians. Because even though it was argued that it was set at an affordable amount, $9 a pill, $9 a pill for somebody living in abject poverty is unachievable. They just cannot pay that, especially on an ongoing basis. Dr. Paul Farmer went ahead and set up an organization called Partners in Health, and they are throughout the world right now in third world countries providing health services for people who cannot afford it. Another individual who you might know and was made famous by the movie is Aaron Brockovich. Aaron Brockovich faced a very, very large corporation, the People's Gas and Electric, and advocated on behalf of the victims who were polluted by the waters and the rivers and the streams and the aquifers. And it seemed to be a losing battle. But Aaron went ahead and took out her slingshot, threw a legal brief, and filed suit. and was able to bring to the people of those communities the monies that they required, so for the most part they could use it for health care. The important thing to note is that neither Dr. Paul Farmer nor Aaron Brockovich did this alone. They were the Davids of our modern times, but they did it with other people. Other people came to their side and walked alongside with them and raised funds alongside with them. And yes, even the church was a part of all those movements. This is an important lesson for us. But what I want to focus on is what was the underlying foundation? What is it that was needed in order for David to have the courage to face Goliath? Or for the people in the army to run off and chase off the Philistines? Or for all the other support groups around them? That is conviction and faith. Ultimately, conviction and faith is going to be more powerful than muscles and might. Conviction and faith could lead an individual or a small group of people to lead an entire movement that could change the world. And this is what we're all about. If you were to go ahead and take a look at the Christian story, our own story, which we narrate Easter after Easter after Easter, it's a story about conviction and faith. It's a story about the small guy going against the big guy. First century Jews that followed Jesus going up against the Roman Empire. And in time, that conviction and faith made us persevere. And many wrongs were made right, and the world was changed. It's not over. In our days, in our times, there are many different battles and challenges for us to rise and overcome. We just need to remember that when it's our turn, we're not going to be alone. A church community will be by our side, but most importantly, the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God will provide for us all that we need. And sometimes that battle will be a very personal battle. It could be with inner demons, or it could be with health, or it could be with other family members, or it could be against an injustice that is put on us. And sometimes it's collective. Sometimes the church, a small little church in a small little corner of Florida, can go ahead and have the conviction and the faith to stand up and change the world. Amen.